Hi, everybody. My name is Burton Rast. I'm an artist and designer from San Francisco, California, and this talk is called Forward, Never Straight. So before we get started, I want to thank Seth, Telegraph, and the Sloss team, Dion and Tech Birmingham, and of course, Rebecca and Natalie, and all the volunteers. Round of applause for the volunteers, please. Shout out to my homie John, who drove up from New Orleans to be with us today. I really enjoy hearing people's personal stories, and today I'm going to share my journey with all of you. If you want to connect, Mr. Burton, spelled out like you see it here, is how to find me all over the web. With that, it is story time. Let's get into it. So growing up, I was an endlessly artistic kid, always sketching and illustrating, designing and doodling, typically alongside my brother David, that's him on the right, and me on the left. Now, what inspired my creations as a kid was Hollywood's growing obsession with computers. Beautiful movies like the original Tron from 1982, absolutely terrible programs with freaky computer graphics like Max Headroom here. Watching Matthew Broderick's characters in Ferris Bueller's Day Off and war games hack on computers, this made me want to know how to use and master computers just like the characters in these films. At the time, my childhood best friend and lifelong brother, Scott Friedman, was the only kid I knew who had a computer. Scott inspired me with all of the early computer graphics and demo scene artwork that was going on at the time. I was dying to know how to make this stuff. There was just one problem. The computers of my childhood were crazy expensive, so we didn't have one in my home. Now, just because I did not have a computer with which to create artistically does not mean that I wasn't exploring other artistic endeavors, specifically that of my own appearance. So I realize this slide gives away that my friends and I were a bunch of delinquent punk rock kids, and you might not know it, but there's actually an upside to being a delinquent kid, and that is, you know other delinquents. At the time, my brother was dating a woman who had a younger brother who was just a criminal. This kid was going to middle school, and his school had just been outfitted with a brand new computer lab full of these. The Macintosh PowerBook Wall Street G3 edition laptop, the first ever pro Mac laptop. Now with him, this kid carried to school one of these. It's an oversized Trapper Keeper brand notebook that was popular in the States in the 80s and 90s, and what he found was you could fit precisely 2 Macintosh PowerBook Wall Street G3 edition laptops into a Trapper Keeper notebook, and that's what he did. He robbed his school blind. He stole every single laptop out of the school's computer lab, and he sold me one for all of $50, my first laptop. And with it, of course, I immediately set out to begin creating artistically. Specifically, I made these fake IDs. So believe it or not, this is an actual fake ID that my brother and I made for my dear friend Justin. Justin is still a brother to me to this day, so I've afforded him a little bit of anonymity via pixelation. But what's important here is not what this is, but how it was made, because this is how I learned to use Photoshop. Now, before we get into Photoshop and design and all that, I want to get back to punk rock for a moment, because there were 2 things that drew me to punk beyond the music. Thing 1, graphic design. Punk is responsible for some of the most iconic imagery in the history of the medium. Super striking logos for bands like Black Flag, Crass, and the Dead Kennedys. They made me want to know how to create these kinds of images and logo marks that my friends and I were wearing all over our clothes. The second thing that drew me to punk was the do-it-yourself ethos, DIY everything. My friends and I made our own clothes, patches and buttons, we cut and dyed our own hair, we wrote graffiti, we designed and printed flyers and album artwork for all of our friends' bands, whatever we were inspired to make. And while this was an inspiring time for me, the problem was I had no idea how to pay rent with my skills as an artist, so I just kept bouncing from one go-nowhere job to the next. Unloading semi-trucks, restaurant back of house, service and hospitality, warehouse gigs, you name it. And having no real direction, plan, or purpose, it really got me down. I felt like I was going to be a minimum wage kid for life. But that's only a small piece of a much larger story, because the truth is, during this time in my life, I was struggling really, really hard. And when I say struggling, I mean it, because this photo was taken the first day I ever did heroin. When you finally emerge after years of addiction, the first thing you notice is all the ways the world around you has changed. A dear friend of mine from high school, Jay Hill, was actively participating in this change. Jay attended art school where he was learning to create these new interactive web-based animations, something I had never seen before. Through my friend, I quickly learned that just like the DIY art and design that drew me to punk, the early web was do-it-yourself and punk as fuck. I was obsessed, and I officially had a new habit. At the time, I was working the front desk at this busted old hotel just north of Chicago. I installed pirated copies of all the software that I wanted to learn on all of the hotel's computers just so I could keep working my new craft in every spare moment that I had between checking in guests. I made motion graphic animations and websites for friends who were artists, photographers, musicians, rave promoters, anyone in my world who was doing anything interesting. And I submitted everything that I created to my favorite design inspiration sites, hoping to someday have my work featured by the industry peers that I looked up to. Sites like this one, Design is Kinky, Surf Station, the FWA, and this, K10K, the first ever web design zine built by a small independent team in San Francisco that included a guy who I would later meet named Mike Buzzard. All that I wanted in the world was to be good enough to be featured on sites like these and for the industry to know that I existed. And when my work was eventually featured, it validated me and helped me to realize that maybe there was actually a place for me in this industry. I landed my first career gig at a little e-learning web startup in Chicago called Focus Impact. I was given the opportunity by this man, my first ever manager and mentor, Todd Ragazza. Todd offered me a job in spite of the fact that I had never before worked in the industry, I had no college degree, and my portfolio was full of work that I had done for my friends, not brands. Like so many startups, our company folded after just a few years, but the impact of Todd's mentorship and friendship still inspires me to this day, and I still reach out and thank him every time I land a new position. Fast forwarding a few years, I fell pretty haphazardly into the ad agency world. This is the flash era of the web in the mid-2000s, and there was a lot of conceptual experimentation going on in the industry at the time, so I thought maybe there was an opportunity here to sort of push my craft. Now, two things that I immediately noticed about the ad agency world. Thing one, awards. Advertising executives love awards. They love to talk about awards, they love to show off their awards, they even pay money to submit their work for even more awards. So much so, it had me immediately wondering, are we working first in service of our audience, like the people for whom we're creating, or are we doing the work just to win a bunch of pointless awards? The second thing that I noticed about the ad agency world was a little bit more unsettling for me. So this is a breakfast cereal bar that I was tasked with selling. I was the creative director for this campaign, and upon receiving the brief from the client, I pretty quickly noticed that they were being super pushy about the kind of words that they wanted us to use when we sold this thing, right? Words like natural and healthy. Now, you don't have to look too closely to see that this particular breakfast cereal bar is covered in fake chocolate sauce, which is your first indication that maybe it isn't the healthiest option. By the way, that's what it looks like in the real world, but that's gross, so let's go back to the retouched version. Now, to be clear, not all ad campaigns are ethically questionable in this way, but this one was, and I worked on a handful of questionable campaigns. And I was often working more than 80 hours a week on these, jumping from one campaign to the next, and ultimately from one agency to the next. And it's easy to feel stuck in this endless cycle. And I did feel stuck, and I didn't know what to do about it. And I became more and more cynical, and more depressed, and more difficult to be around for my family, friends, and loved ones, until one day, I finally realized, wait a minute, I don't have to do this shit anymore.
And to that I say, take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more.
So I quit my job to pursue my dream of never again working in the ad agency world. I packed my bags, I sold all of my belongings, and I hit the road to clear my head and travel the world until my bank account was dead empty. Reflecting on these two experiences and what I learned, both the startup and the agency worlds require hard work and long hours. But in my first job at the startup, I had an inspiring and dedicated mentor, whereas in the agency world, I had none. In Todd, I learned just what kind of a leader I want to be, mentoring others and giving opportunities to folks outside of the usual suspect hiring channels, something I encourage everyone here to do. Whereas in the agency world, I learned exactly who I do not want to be. When I returned home from traveling, I decided to kind of contract and freelance around while I searched for an opportunity that better aligned with who I was and the kind of work that I wanted to do. Ultimately, this search led me to a design firm called IDEO, beginning a 7-year chapter in my life and a journey that would ultimately move me clear across the country. Now, two things that I immediately noticed about IDEO. Thing one, literally everyone at IDEO understands that design is, at its core, about solving for unmet human needs. The second thing I learned about IDEO is that they tackle really big challenges across a ton of different industries. A few really quick examples of some favorite projects of mine that launched while I was there. First, IDEO designed new voting machines for Los Angeles County. It's the largest jurisdiction in the United States with more than 10 million people, so a lot of really important and pressing design challenges when you're creating for such a considerable audience. Next, in Peru, IDEO designed an entire scalable network of schools for the ground up for the growing Peruvian middle class, and I actually lived and worked in Peru for the spring and summer of 2016 with these folks, so work that's really near and dear to my heart. And lastly, IDEO did incredibly important work for Planned Parenthood, redesigning the patient experience for the millions of women who rely on their services, and an initiative that I will forever be proud of. So it goes without saying, this is a different kind of company and opportunity than I had previously experienced. I was super excited to be a part of it and to learn from all of my inspiring new teammates. This honeymoon period, though, it would be a kind of short-lived one for me, because looking around, I quickly realized how different my story was from the people around me. Because in my mind, I was still this fucked up kid, and while I had been struggling, my new teammates had instead been attending Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, CIID, UMIO, the Royal College of Art, like the top design programs in the world. So what this led to in me was a feeling that I had never before experienced. It's a psychological pattern called imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome means that you think you're a fake and a fraud, even though everyone around you knows that you're actually pretty great. It's a scary feeling, and I was absolutely terrified. To give you an idea of just how scared I was, when I was first hired here at IDEO's studio in Chicago, rather than eat lunch with my new teammates, I would instead visit a corner store across the street, buy a cheap little sandwich, and walk 2 blocks to sit beneath a viaduct adjacent a nearby highway to eat my lunch alone. I did this because I was afraid that if I ate lunch with my new teammates, they would ask me questions about my background and quickly learn that I did not belong here. It took me a while before I emerged from beneath my viaduct, but there were two design directors who went out of their way to help me adjust and understand the unique value that I brought, John Wedderston and Jerry O'Leary. John was officially made my mentor. He and I were among the first to bring the disciplines of emerging digital technologies to IDEO, so he was the perfect fit to help me navigate my career. Jerry saw that I was pretty nervous around my new teammates, and one day he pulled me aside for a quick chat. He said, quote, "I know you think what we all do is magic. You should know that we think what you know how to do is magic as well." Jerry affirmed that I belonged in spite of the fact that I did not have an impressive background like so many of my new peers. And it turns out he was right, because soon after I was hired, my teammates began asking me to teach them the stuff that I know how to do. With John's support, I co-founded a weekly workshop series called Nerd Night, where I designed and hosted classes for my teammates on any topics that they chose. With each workshop that I hosted, something in me began to shift. More important than my own learning was that I was elevating my colleagues, making all of us better in the process. Over the years, my teaching tradition continued. I was flown to IDEO's New York and Boston studios to run workshops for my teammates there. The company then partnered with the Spark program, a career development initiative for kids in Chicago. Through this, I worked with this brilliant kid named Luis, teaching him how to design and code this killer game demo that we called Spicy Squid and the Saltwater Syndicate. And I convinced IDEO and Adobe to donate a Mac laptop in the Creative Cloud suite of apps to enable Luis to keep creating. Our project was so beloved, the city of Chicago even wrote about our collaboration on their official blog. Back in the IDEO studio, other teammates also began teaching through my workshop series. I learned hardware hacking from colleagues with backgrounds in mechanical and electrical engineering, and storytelling from our marketing and editorial staff. I published blog posts for the IDEO site and even got my start doing public speaking, learning how to tell more personal and meaningful stories than the client presentations from my agency past. Through all of this, the most valuable lesson I learned is a really simple one, that we all have so much to offer and learn from one another. Realizing my role in this helped me to understand my purpose, both in my career and in my life. After 4.5 years in IDEO's Chicago studio, I accepted an offer to transfer to the company's San Francisco headquarters. When I arrived, I quickly learned that I had left a design firm in Chicago and joined a consulting firm in San Francisco. Now, that's all well and good, but I'm a designer and a maker, not a consultant, so this location wasn't a great fit, and I knew that I would soon move on. But then, something happened from which I still, to this day, struggle to move on. As I mentioned, in the spring and summer of 2016, I was living and working with an IDEO team and our client here in Lima, in Peru. About halfway through our project, I had to skip back up to the Northern Hemisphere for a couple of conferences. First, I flew back home to San Francisco to link up with a different IDEO team. We flew clear across the country to Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, to do an installation at this killer music and technology festival called MoogFest. We made this crazy interactive installation that allowed people to make music by hitting giant beach balls. We called it the Beach Ball Synth, the brainchild of my brilliant former teammate, Aaron Soloway. But after just a few days at MoogFest, I had to fly home to San Francisco, where I had only 31 hours to prepare before leaving for Barcelona to present at a design conference called the Off Festival. As I was landing at the airport in San Francisco, I flipped my phone off of airplane mode, and before the wheels of the plane had even touched the ground, I learned that my oldest and closest friend in the world, Scott Friedman, had died. He was just 37 years old. The following evening, instead of flying to Barcelona, I took a red-eye overnight from San Francisco to our hometown of Chicago. I then gave the most emotional talk of my life when I read the eulogy at his memorial service. Scott always lifted me up and celebrated me. He had been so proud when I received the invitation to present at the Awe Festival. Both his family and mine insisted that the right thing to do would be to honor his memory in this way. So when the memorial service ended, I went straight to the airport in Chicago, flew to Barcelona via London, and just a day after I delivered the eulogy, I was on stage at the Awe Festival dedicating my talk to Scott. When you experience such a considerable loss, your whole world goes black and white. Everything is either good or bad, up or down, positive or negative. Looking back at how I coped, I don't know. Like maybe it was art therapy, maybe it was about control or distraction, maybe it was just me finding a way to represent the starkness of my emotional world. But when I finally returned home to San Francisco, on a walk near my home, I shot this photo. It's not a good photo, and it's not a very good edit, but I was experimenting with a direction, and I was keeping busy. About a week later, I shot this photo, and once again, neither a great image nor a great edit, but I was still experimenting and still learning. A few months later, while I was traveling for work, I woke up early in my hotel in New York City, just north of the legendary Flatiron Building. I grabbed my camera and my tripod, and I finally made an image that I loved. So now I had a style to explore. And just a few months later, Adobe gave my process a huge boost when they pushed out an update to their Lightroom mobile app that allowed it to both capture and edit raw format images. So what this meant was I officially had a mobile photo studio in my pocket at all times, and I began creating images with characteristic obsessiveness. On April 1st, 2017, I began a 100-day project, that is, making 100 images in 100 days, a series that I called The Shapes of San Francisco. So these are some of the images that I created during the first 100 days of a project that has continued to evolve and ultimately define me to this day. As I shared my daily images, I began receiving super positive feedback from trusted designer and photographer friends. It was through their positivity and encouragement that I did something I have never done before. I sent a few unsolicited images to the photo editor for the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. To my shock, just 10 minutes later, he wrote me back and then he said that he really liked my work. Even more shocking, a week and a half later, he actually published my images. I couldn't believe it. I was officially published by the biggest newspaper in San Francisco. I didn't even care that they called me Instagrammer, right? Like reducing my human identity to just like one of billions of users of a social network. But what ultimately surprised me even more than the newspaper feature was that it didn't end there, because then Design Boom picked up my work, then F-Stoppers, one of my favorite photo blogs. IDEO asked me to write a blog post about my ongoing project. NBC News' Bay Area station featured me on their Instagram, as did CNN in Greece. I will never understand this one, but certainly I am appreciative. I was interviewed by Petapixel, a super popular photo blog that I've been following for years, and Cult of Mac, who was interested due to the whole like shot on iPhone angle. And all the while I kept experimenting and evolving my style ever more. I even very briefly played around with adding a bit of color to my images, which caught the eye of a particular company in Cupertino, California, who sent me this email, subject line, potential Apple Instagram feature. And on Halloween morning, 2017, exactly 7 months from the day that I began my 100-day project, as I was walking into work in the morning, my phone began like uncontrollably buzzing in my pocket. I thought it was a family emergency, but it was Apple featuring my work on their page. In the years since, I have gone on to create collections for every city that I have visited for lectures, workshops, travel, work, whatever. From Chicago to Mexico City, Sao Paulo to Vienna, New York, Geneva, London, Tel Aviv, making literally thousands of images. Madrid and Barcelona, Munich and Berlin, Moscow and St. Petersburg when I lectured in both of those cities, everywhere that I've been. I am super proud of all of the work that I've created, but as with all things in life, my creations have come at a cost. There's no getting around the fact that I've made this enormous body of work born out of loss and intense emotional suffering. And I recently happened upon a conversation between Anthony Bourdain, rest in peace, and the artist David Choe, where they were discussing precisely this. Have a listen.
Do you think a certain level of dissatisfaction or unhappiness is an integral part of the creative process?
I think even great art can be created when you're happy, but I think the best art in the universe is created through intense suffering. So then, do you put yourself in a situation where you're constantly in pain? And the answer to that question is yes.
So I wasn't originally going to talk about this idea. I didn't know whether it was perhaps irresponsible to imply that emotional hardship is essential for making great art. But then someone really close to me sent me a piece the musician Nick Cave wrote to one of his fans about the utility of suffering. He said, quote, "What do we do with suffering? As far as I can see, we have two choices. We either transform our suffering into something else, or we hold on to it and eventually pass it on. In order to transform our pain, we must acknowledge that all people suffer. By understanding that suffering is the universal unifying force, we can see people more compassionately, and this goes some way toward helping us forgive the world and ourselves. By acting compassionately, we reduce the world's net suffering and defiantly rehabilitate the world." So this is how I've chosen to forgive the world, by presenting it in a way that's uniquely beautiful to me. And through this, I learned to forgive myself, to see myself and others more compassionately, and to reduce suffering ever more so by the day. Some press, a bunch of interviews, and an Apple feature. It didn't exactly solve for everything I was going through, but the positivity and encouragement felt good. Back at IDEO in San Francisco, a couple of really interesting things were happening. First, after 2 full years without any mentorship, I connected with another super inspiring design director named Kate Lydon. Kate went out of her way to lift me up when she saw that I had no support and I was going through a really hard time. For this, I will forever love and appreciate her. And next, at the time, I was asked to help out with a team who was pitching work for Google. Now, interestingly, I had already been talking to Google about a potential role there. And my first conversation with the company was with a particular guy who was introduced to me through a couple of close mutual friends, Mike Buzzard. That is the same Mike Buzzard who worked on K10K, the webzine featuring all of the work that I so admired when I was just dreaming of finding my place in the industry nearly 20 years earlier. Ultimately, I accepted a role at Google where I spent the next 5.5 years as a UX design lead in San Francisco. Mike continues to be an invaluable friend and mentor to me. Through him, I've grown quite a lot. And through this chapter in my life, most importantly, I've learned that we never stop needing guidance and support. Work is hard, life is hard, and you never know what the people around you are going through. So be kind to one another. During my time at IDEO, I was surprised to learn that I wasn't the only one there feeling insecure about whether or not I belonged. Later on, I learned the same is true at Google and most everywhere else in our creative industries. So I ran a poll across my networks. I asked 1,000 former IDEO employees and 6,000 current Google UX designers, that is the entire global Google UX design list, do you experience imposter syndrome in your role? Roughly 90% of all respondents said that they had experienced the condition, more than 60% at both companies reporting that they experience it a lot. So given just a quick survey and some informal data, I knew I was onto something. So I decided to dig deeper to figure out why this is. The term homeostasis was coined by this man, a physiologist named Walter Bradford Cannon, way back in 1926. Cannon revealed that our bodies have built-in mechanisms to regulate our temperature, oxygen, water, protein, and all sorts of other conditions to keep us alive and healthy. He named this physiological process homeostasis. In her 2019 book, Never Enough: The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction, author and psychologist Judith Brisell explains that addiction is also a byproduct of homeostasis. When we get high, the brain produces excess dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure. It makes us feel good. In response to the high, the brain reduces natural dopamine production to achieve balance or homeostasis. This makes another hit of the drug necessary not to get high anymore, but just to feel normal. But here's the thing. This idea of homeostasis, it also works on our emotions. When we receive a positive emotional uplift, our brains immediately work to regulate and find emotional balance, making it difficult for the positive feeling to last. This is why when we achieve success, we can never get enough. We run from one achievement to the next. New job title, more money, more status, clients, sales, or success, first to keep feeling good, and then to avoid feeling awful. This emotional balance that our brains are constantly working to achieve in spite of our desperate desire to keep feeling good, it also has a name. The hedonic treadmill is the unending race against the inevitability of homeostasis. Why a treadmill? Well, because no matter how fast we run, we never arrive. Of this idea, the psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald T. Campbell wrote back in 1971, quote, "The nature of adaptation condemns humans to live on a hedonic treadmill, to seek new levels of stimulation merely to maintain old levels of subjective pleasure, to never achieve any kind of permanent happiness or satisfaction. In other words, we are all pre-programmed to prioritize short-term achievements over long-term happiness, just like a drug addict." So, kicking the habit and stepping off the treadmill, it's not easy. I'll be the first to admit I'm not immune to any of this. Getting my work featured when I was just starting in the industry, that first job offer from the startup, IDEO, Google, having my photography featured by Apple and so many others, like all of that felt really good, especially so after I struggled so hard as a kid. Now, don't get me wrong, setting and striving toward goals is certainly a good thing, but it's important to keep perspective. Because while achievements do feel good in the moment, we shouldn't confuse them with deep, long-term satisfaction. The jobs and awards we're offered, products, commissions, and campaigns that we create and launch, they all serve their purpose for a moment in time, making us feel good for a little while, and then we move on in search of a new goal. But when we instead measure our progress or contribution through the success of others, that lasts forever. Making others successful can be as simple as reaching out and offering support when you see someone struggling, like Kate and Jerry did for me at IDEO. Or providing an opportunity to someone who doesn't have the same background or experience that other candidates do, like Todd did for me at the startup. Even sharing a coffee or a quick portfolio review can be super valuable, not only for a teammate or candidate, but also for our own growth as leaders. And the more we grow, the better position that we are to elevate one another, divorcing our own sense of achievement from the hedonic treadmill as we instead become invested in the success of others. Because our purpose, as we all grow to become leaders of our respective industries, is first and foremost to one another. That we work every day to open doors and create opportunities for one another. This is our responsibility, and I know this because I've learned more about myself working in service of others than I ever have working for companies, clients, or credibility. That is my story. Thank you all for sharing your time with me.